no matter what the positive number is on our revenue forecast today, the likelihood that we will need to step in for that federal withdrawal is higher than what we've gained today. And so while this is a positive, I share with you that it's a muted positive.
Well, that's Seattle City Council member Dan Strauss talking about a muted positive economic forecast. What does that mean for Seattle's budget? Are there really more dollars for the city to spend? Plus, your ballot either came in the mail or you're just a few days away from receiving it, along with a torrent of political advertising. We're tracking that issue too. And a plan for a school resource officer or a school enforcement officer at Garfield High School. That did not get a passing grade. Why does Seattle Public Schools want to keep a ban in place when it comes to having cops on campus? All this and more in focus this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I was going to try to make some connection to the Mariners season as a muted positive, but I'm just feeling more muted than anything else over that heartbreaking loss to the Blue Jays in the winner-take-all Game 7 of the American League Championship Series. How are you doing, man?
Yeah, it's tough. The comparison I've been making is it feels like a pet died or something. You know, it's that kind of, not 5-alarm fire tragedy, but enough to kind of ruin your day.
Oh, yeah.
It's sad. And I'm sorry that it ended on such a heartbreaking note because it is a successful season and we should feel good about it. It's just when you get that close to something and fall short, it's pretty tough.
The only way it could have been worse if that had happened in the 9th inning. I'm just throwing that out there. There's a lot of different ways to make it terrible.
That's true.
We'll talk more about it.
7th is a close second.
Yeah, for sure. Well, David, thank you as always for joining me. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to the patrons of the show. A few free patrons have signed on in the last few weeks. Thanks a ton for doing that. It would be so great, though, if you could support the show with an amount as low as $5 per month. Works out to about $1.25 a show. What a deal. Paid patrons get immediate access to Patrons First podcast. You get your own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal and so much more. Find this program on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, thanks for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge's YouTube site Wednesday nights at 7. All right, time to get going here. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, we're going to see several budget amendments from the Seattle City Council this week. I'm going to aim to talk about those next week so we can digest a little bit more about what's going on there. But we did receive a clearer picture, I think, of the conditions that council members are working under with this economic forecast on Monday that looks positive, but definitely some provisos here. You wrote about this for the Seattle Times. The council has about $12 million more to spend potentially, which isn't a ton of money when you consider the $2 billion general fund they're working with, but it is something. Let's talk about this. Council President Nelson called it cautious optimism ahead here. What's going on? How do you assess this?
I think it's good news in that it doesn't contain bad news is sort of how I read it, which is the mayor's budget proposal gives these council people very little flexibility to move around because he really squeezed every last dollar that he could out of the city's budget, including, some fairly big assumptions about what voters will do, about how departments are going to behave next year. And so already the council people were coming into this without a lot of wiggle room for getting their priorities funded. And so the big question was, if this forecast came in negative, even just a little bit, that would basically put them in a position that no politician wants to be in right before an election, which is only having to make cuts. So in that sense, it's good news that the overall picture does not change that much. So they are not going to have to be in a position to find cuts. And in fact, they get somewhere between $12 and $14 million to play around with for whatever priorities they might have. So in that sense, it's a good thing. Mostly the takeaway from here is the picture has not significantly changed.
I sense that too. And I did want to make sure we talked about that because there were some pessimistic forecasts that happened in the summertime. And I wanted to look a little bit ahead here, if I could, in terms of what could derail things. I don't want to always accentuate the negative, but I am trying to figure out what's what here. Has the impact of tariffs truly kicked in yet? Is it the job market that's the big concern? What could change things in the future when it comes to this economic outlook and what the council is really planning on over the next couple of months?
Well, I mean, for one, the concern of the city economists has kind of shifted in an interesting way away from inflation a bit, although that is still there, and more toward the job market being squishy. When they started doing these forecasts, the job market looked pretty good, but, with all these tariffs, everybody was concerned that inflation was going to skyrocket. That hasn't really come to pass, which is actually sort of part of why the forecast is not that bad, which is that their expectations in April when they made that pessimistic forecast where that inflation would jump, and it really hasn't in a significant way. But now the concern is, particularly for the payroll tax that has been doing so much heavy lifting, if the job numbers continue to get squishy, particularly in the tech world, then that account in particular is going to drop faster than people might have expected.
Right.
And the city's budget is built really heavily on sales tax and consumer spending. So if that goes down, that could take a bite out of things. Just in general, if demand for, construction continues to be slow as it is right now, a lot of the city's budget is built on real estate excise taxes and the sales taxes that come out of just all the materials they have to buy to build the building. I mean, basically what we're talking about is a recession. If a recession happens, that the way that the city's budget is built is pretty recession vulnerable because, we're talking about consumer spending and payroll taxes and construction, and all those things tend to go down when the job market isn't looking so good.
Yeah, this is going to be a very interesting needle to thread for the council in the weeks ahead here. I think you're right. There isn't a lot of room for them to move on this budget in terms of adding new things, not a lot of excess to work with. I know mayors in the past have allowed for a little bit more room than certainly we're seeing out of this proposal from Mayor Harrell. But yeah, I'm interested to see what happens over the next couple of weeks, and we will take a closer look at some of those amendments that council members are looking at next week, folks, so stick around for that. And I did want to make sure I mentioned, if you haven't seen it already, folks, check that mailbox. There's very likely a ballot in there, along with about 10,000 mailers from various campaigns. David, I wanted to first look at the ballot for Seattle voters. This kind of crept up on me here, but here's the breakdown that I'm looking at. We have a mayor's race, 2 citywide council seats, city attorney, 2 citywide propositions, one for public school support programs, the other to revamp the city's business and operations taxing system. Then you have 3 school district board races, King County Executive, county emergency medical funding, 4 county council member seats, 4 state legislator positions, and a measure to change the way Washington's long-term care program is funded. If I missed something, everybody out there, I apologize. But David, I just see this as a really crowded ballot in a non-presidential year, and I wonder how voters are able to focus on all of this. What do you think?
It is a crowded ballot, and there's a lot of conversation around should we be voting on local things in even years. I think this is perhaps an argument that people who oppose that make, which is this is already a quite crowded ballot. Do you really want to put all this stuff on top of all the other things we already have on the even year? Yeah, it's a crowded ballot, and people are going to have to find ways to streamline their decision making. I do think that's why endorsements still matter, because it's hard for the average person to kind of sift through exactly what they believe through every one of these individual races. I think it's why, despite having a depleted reporter staff, the stranger's endorsement still matters quite a bit, because, and I'm not casting blame here, it is really difficult to have totally informed positions on each one of these that are on the ballot. So yeah, it's a long list. That's why us news reporters are here.
That's right. I hope so. Yeah, I'm having some trouble with some of these different races too, folks. So don't feel alone. Do some research on school board and all these other ones too. There is a lot to consider out here. I did want to talk also about how money is pouring into these races, has been pouring into these races over the last couple of weeks before Election Day on November 4th. We've talked about the Seattle mayor's race, specifically the political action committees supporting the candidates there. The Harrell PAC has raised about $1.6 million as of the last check I saw with Seattle Ethics and Elections there. The Wilson PAC about $350,000, so a major discrepancy there. But I saw a piece in the Washington Observer about this, David. You have races like the Nelson versus Foster battle for citywide position 9 on the Seattle City Council. Nelson was down 23 points in the primary, but she's just received more than $100,000 in backing from a group of commercial property owners. Then Claudia Balducci, 14 points back in the primary for King County Executive. Her PAC just got a $125,000 boost for the Master Builders Group recently. David, we've touched on this before. If a candidate finished the primary down by double digits, I would think that maybe they wouldn't get as much funding coming their way, but clearly some of these business-oriented groups in our region really want to spend some money. What are you seeing in all this?
I'll say that I think Balducci and Nelson are probably different stories just because the executive race was so splintered in a kind of meaningful way. It's hard to parse exactly. I mean, I do think she's the underdog in this race, though I would say she probably has a better shot than Nelson. Nelson, I don't think I'm going too far out of my skis to say she's in deep, deep trouble. And it's hard to imagine her kind of pulling herself out of that hole. And so, yeah, it's a decent question. Why spend this money? I mean, I think these PACs have a certain amount of money to spend, and they put it where their ideals are. And by spending this money, they're of course trying to help these people win. They're also just sort of signaling to their donors in the future, these are the kinds of candidates we support, and we will support them robustly. So continue to please give to us, and we'll keep spending. Sarah Nelson is a property management groups and developer groups really like her. She has been a skeptic on some of the landlord tenant regulations that the city has, and she pushed for for example, the Soto rezone that a lot of developer groups liked. I think those groups in particular are quite nervous about what it will mean if she and Mayor Harrell go down. I think suddenly the city hall that they have a good relationship with right now will get a lot harder for them to work with. And so, they have the money to spend. It's their mission to do it, and that's why they're doing it.
Yeah, it's going to be a big money spend over the next couple of weeks here. So keep an eye on that mailbox, because those mailers are just going to keep on coming. So thank you very much for that, David. All right, coming up, a plan for a 1-year pilot to have a school resource officer at Garfield High School in Seattle scrapped. Why did this plan not receive support from the Seattle Public Schools Board? Some answers next on Now Hear This. Well, last week, the Seattle Public Schools Board of Directors rejected by a 5-2 vote a plan to have a school resource officer, they were calling it a school enforcement officer, from the Seattle Police Department on campus for a 1-year pilot. The district banned officers from its campuses in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's murder, but there has been plenty of talk about having officers on campus after the shooting death of student Amar Murphy Payne on the Garfield campus last year as he was trying to break up a fight. The plan for an officer, as Seattle Police Chief Sean Barnes explained to me a few months ago on Seattle Channel, was not to be an officer in full uniform, and it was suggested that the officer would not be involved in school discipline.
It looks like someone who is in the school system, perhaps not in uniform, or a softer uniform is what they sometimes say.
Yeah.
It looks like someone that has the resources and the understanding to identify kids that may be in crisis or may need help. It looks like someone that has a cell phone full of phone numbers that I wish every police officer had.
So, David, despite support from the chief, the mayor, the school principal, this plan has been scrapped by the SPS board. A lot of pushback from the community. Many at last week's meeting on this said their concerns weren't included in the memorandum of understanding created for this project between the school and the police department. It just seems like to me that Seattle Public Schools has been in a rough spot for the last couple months, and maybe even longer than that. But right now we know they're in an interim superintendent mode. It just sounds like they didn't build enough community trust over this issue. Or what are you seeing here? I thought there was some impetus towards this, and it looks like it's not coming through.
Yeah, the school board is it's kind of a foreign land to me.
Me too.
The interpersonal politics, I gather from reading the coverage, are quite intense. And you're talking. This is kind of a residual 2020 issue, and it still has some of the salience it did then, which is I just think there's a lot of intense feelings when it comes around having law enforcement be the kind of bearers of public safety. Of course, some people still feel uncomfortable with that, but then there are the safety concerns. There are also questions about how much difference does it make. So no, I'm frankly, again, this is purely from an outsider's view. I'm a little surprised that it was rejected so handily. I don't know exactly all the ins and outs. I'm with you. I felt like the pendulum had kind of started swinging back in the other way. And, Mayor Harrell has been a supportive of this. And,
yes.
And he's not one usually to stick his neck out for something that will fail politically. If he supports something we can say about Mayor Harrell, he usually tries to be on the majority side of that. And so,
right. So social housing notwithstanding. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. There are exceptions to that rule. But historically, I think that's been the case, or at least his reputation. And so the fact that you have this kind of establishment support for this and then it still goes down strikes me as surprising. I just think from what I gather, there's just a lot of intense feelings still wrapped up in this debate.
Yep, and there are a number of school board positions that are on the ballot this year too. So that definitely had that tinged this conversation as well, as I understand it. I did want to take it one step further here because I'm wondering what happens with investments from the FEP levy. This is the Families Education Preschool and Promise levy, which I will presume will pass this November. Voters have been very supportive of this. These are city dollars that end up helping out with programs at Seattle Public Schools. And it does include money to promote public safety outside Seattle's public schools. I just wonder what that's going to look like with so much concern about cops on campus. Do you have a feel for that at all? Like how the city's going to work around this issue that clearly is a very hot issue around Garfield High School for sure?
No, I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. I do know that that has already been a recurring question. I think it was even in Mayor Harrell's press conference announcing the new proposal is this going to include school resource officers? And it was always a little hemmed and hawed because I think there is some understanding about the sensitivity around this question. The fact that we're talking about Seattle money possibly funding that, I think makes it politically even a little more precarious because we're talking about two different jurisdictions here,
right,
Seattle Public
right.
Schools and City of Seattle. And so having city money funding this puts Seattle kind of in the middle of that intense debate in a way that City Hall, I think, probably enjoys usually being a part of.
Yeah. And I was going to say, Seattle Public Schools makes the call on are these officers going to be on campus or not. That's the bottom line here. Yeah,
but if you get city money for this, then you do then the city council does kind of have a stake to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. It's a tough issue that I won't claim to be fully up to speed on. It is also evidence to me that 2020 is not fully in our rearview mirror, that these sorts of debates are still in some sectors alive and well.
Yeah, important to note that too. Thank you for that, David. I did want to follow up on a story that we have discussed in the podcast in the past. The nude beach at Denny Blaine Park can stay open until the spring. This was the recent ruling from a King County Superior Court judge, Samuel Chung, who said the city's efforts at this park, with fencing, etc., had abated concerns from neighbors of the park about illegal and lewd behavior. David, you reported on this in the past. Your colleague Catalina Gaitan had this most recent story. And this park has long been a haven for Seattle's LGBTQ community. The city really sees this as a victory, this court decision here. But I'm wondering, is it the city's abatement work that has been shining through here, or the fact that autumn has hit and it's not really nude beach weather? I'm wondering what you think about this ruling.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't been down there since they've done the work. I've seen some pictures though, and there are these, kind of barriers that they put up to try and fence off. I think where the city had lost before is the judge was not convinced that they were taking the issue seriously, that he basically concluded that they knew about it and were not doing anything about it. It being the kind of offensive, sort of explicitly lewd behavior. So I take this ruling not to be anything permanent, but his kind of finally acknowledging the city does appear to actually be trying to come up with a solution here, and so therefore he's willing to give them a little more time. This whole issue has been very fascinating because, we're talking about a very small park here, and yet it has consumed a lot of public oxygen. But I think the reason for that is it contains just kind of so many like microcosms of Seattle politics. You've got there's some like alternative communities, LGBT communities, and then you've got, police enforcement, and you've got the rich, wealthy neighbors, and you've got kind of behind the scenes dealing between city officials and people who have donated to those city officials' campaigns. And so it's just got all these kind of storylines wrapped up in this very small park. The city, interestingly, has taken this pretty strong position that they think it should be a nude beach. Like they said this in court, like we endorse this as a nude beach. What we don't endorse is the kind of, less appropriate, quote, lewd behavior. But then there's this debate between the neighbors and the city over what constitutes lewd behavior. Does just being naked at the beach count, or do you have to be doing something, that we won't repeat on this podcast?
Yeah, right.
And so, it's a tricky and interesting position. And I'll say I feel for the lawyers in the city attorney's office who are trying to parse the difference between appropriate nudity and lewd nudity. And I wonder if that's what they thought they'd be arguing in court when they went to law school.
Right. Who knew? But some of the language that they're using here, the city's filing said this park is a sacred place, quote, a sacred place in the lives of queer and trans Seattleites. So I think, that's kind of the legal argument that they're making here. Is that kind of what you're reading out of this?
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that they're trying to strike a balance. I know this is not the Harrell administration dictating legal strategy here, but I do think it is kind of reflective of how the Harrell administration often tries to operate, which is try and strike this balance that keeps everybody happy. Sometimes that strategy, though, makes nobody happy.
Right.
And I think that is what's going on here. They're being pretty explicit that they're trying to preserve this as a new beach while also trying to assuage the concerns of the neighbors. I would say for the most part, the judge has been more sympathetic to the neighbors and the people who are concerned about some of the behavior at the beach. But this is the first time that he, I think, has kind of gone more on the side of the city.
Last touch on this. Any idea how this case is going to unfold in the spring? You've still got this group that is very upset about what's going on. They've, gotten photos and had observers saying, people are going into the clothing required section with no clothes on and things of this nature. So it does seem a little bit messy. Any idea how this might resolve itself in the spring and where the court's going to go with this?
Yeah, my read is the neighborhood group is they appear to me not be all that willing to back down on their opposition, frankly, to this park's current use. They have been pretty stringent. And I think what they want at the end of the day is for this to not be a nude beach anymore. I'm kind of reading into this a little maybe further than what they've said explicitly, but that has been an argument that their lawyer has made sometimes in court, that they've included nudity generally in their definition of lewd behavior. So what that means as far as the final resolution on this park, I don't know. I was kind of surprised the last time the judge made a ruling. He initially at least seemed to say nudity at this park is done. He kind of backtracked that a little bit when the city came forward with a plan to make it a little more gentle, perhaps. But no, I don't have a great read on how this eventually ends. Two possibilities are he says, we think the city's done enough and therefore we're all good here. Or he could go as far as saying, nudity at this beach is now illegal.
Wow. There's a lot going on here. So we'll see what happens in the spring. A few months to wait for that. All right. Well, coming up, an appeals court has said this week, yes, President Trump, you can send National Guard troops to Portland. What's behind that decision? What does that mean for Seattle? Some discussion of these topics coming up on What's Next. On Monday of this week, a split decision from a 3-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals granting the Justice Department's request to put a hold on a judge's order that had blocked the deployment of National Guard troops to Portland, while a legal challenge to Trump's plan to use these troops continues. So that means the president's plan to send troops for now appears to be full speed ahead. 2 Trump-appointed judges said yes to this. 1 Clinton-appointed judge said no. David, any thoughts about what this means for Portland? Because the protests have not been huge from what I've seen. They haven't been violent from what I've seen, but it really seems like facts of that nature really haven't stopped the deployment in any of the other cities.
No, I don't. I mean, I think the kind of essential question here is, well, I mean, there is the broader view on sending National Guard troops into cities generally and how that feels and how that looks. And I don't want to be dismissive that is a dramatic sight to see people dressed up in military gear in American cities. Mm-hmm. There is a sort of nuance, I think, between whether those people, the scope of those people's responsibilities. Are they purely kind of running security on an ICE building? That's one thing, because the deployment language that the federal government has put out there talks about protecting federal personnel and property. Yeah. In that case, I think the deployment will feel a little bit limited to most of Portland, and if they are truly kind of cordoned to the federal facilities. The other kind of the fear I think that people have, though, is that directive also sort of mentions using them to help federal officers carry out their duties, in which case then the thought is, okay, are we going to see National Guards people out on immigration raids throughout the city? And I think that is a much more dramatic and frightening sight to people living in Seattle, because that would be much more citywide. And then, how many loopholes can you use that? How much further can you use those operations as sort of an excuse to be deployed within the city, kind of more woven into a city? If that's the scenario, it becomes a lot more kind of dramatic and I think probably obvious to the average citizen.
Yeah. And this comes as the Harrell administration is working on 2 pieces of legislation. One would ban the use of face masks by law enforcement. We've seen a lot of ICE officers acting in this way. There's another piece of legislation that would prohibit the use of city property for federal immigration enforcement to the extent possible by law. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out when we see this legislation drop in a couple of weeks, David. But it sounds like the mayor is trying to take some preemptive steps here, but it sure sounds, I'm not a lawyer, but it sure sounds like very complicated legal ground to be on right now.
I agree. And, how do you legislate something that hasn't happened yet? I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to react to something that hasn't happened yet. I'm sure that the cities and states lawyers are well prepared for if that were to occur. I think there's probably a little bit of electioneering, politicking happening here, which is your forecast. He forecast this legislation a week ago before the legislation is presented. Then he'll introduce it again. He's going to do all of this before the election. So I do think that is one piece of it, but also I'm sure it's prudent to have your kind of legal and political strategy all squared away just in case, rather than reacting to when something is actually unfolding. Yeah,
hear that loud and clear. All right, well, David, it is time to wrap up, and I need to revisit the Mariners with you if I can. Is there something that you would change about this team from this year to next? I don't know what happened in right field, but Dominic Canzone was absolutely awful after hitting 300 during the regular season. That was so tough to watch him struggle. Any thoughts about what needs to change on this Mariners team or what they could change?
I have specific thoughts. I think generally though, what they need to show is that, I saw that Cal Raleigh last night called it a failure that they didn't make it to the World Series, and that I hope is the overriding feeling running through the Mariners, because that has not been the feeling running through the Mariners in the entire Jerry Dipoto era. Sure. I think the feeling is we're going to try and build a consistent winner. Yep. Now I hope the feeling is it is a failure if we don't make it and win a World Series. And if that's true, then I think the best way to make the pain of last night go away is to sign Josh Naylor, go out and sign Alex Bregman to play third base, make big moves that prove that you view not winning the World Series as a failure.
Yeah, that's I struggled with that too, because you look at this season, any team would love to be in that position, but the Mariners are different. And I hear what you're saying. It's a different kind of mindset there, where it's just like, we're going to compete every year. It's like, no, we need more than that. And it just doesn't, when you haven't been to the World Series, unlike every other Major League Baseball team, I think you have to, I don't know, it's a hard thing to say. And I know Cal Raleigh was in tears half the time last night when he was talking about that kind of thing, but I hear what you're saying. It's just kind of a different, sort of a change of mindset, I guess.
Well, yeah, and if you want to give the front office credit, they are well positioned to be a team that's pushing to win the World Series without forfeiting their future. I think they can do both of those things. They have their TV situation should be worked out. So, they had a bunch of extra sold out home games, so they should have money.
Yep.
They have an enthusiastic fan base. They have a great farm system. This is a team that, I understand when you're rebuilding from nothing,
right,
your goal should be to create a stable base from which to build. And if we're going to give the front office any credit, they have, I think, done that. They have a pretty stable base from which to build. But the big hit on them is they haven't done that. They haven't, after building the base, they haven't made the leap under the next echelon. I think they did this year finally a bit at the trade deadline, and I think that's encouraging. I just very much hope that this offseason is not like all the others, and that they reward the fans whose hearts were all broken last night with a commitment and a convincing argument that they are not satisfied unless they get back there again next year.
I like it. Let's keep this party rolling. Absolutely, David. A heartbreaker, but I know I'm going to be back next year, like you will too. Thank you, David. And thanks everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. If you want to be a patron and support the show, do it. Please pledge $5 per month or more on Patreon to Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Very much appreciate your support. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. We are there. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.